Welcome back, students, to our next unit for AP European History. We are starting not only a new unit, but also a new time period as well. So far, we've covered time period 1 and time period 2 in first quarter and second quarter. So as we start third quarter, we are starting time period 3, which is going to begin with the Industrial Revolution. And this is also a unit on its own. These series of PowerPoints will be broken up into 2 parts, and so tonight you will be responsible for part 1. After you are done taking these notes on this PowerPoint, you are also responsible for finishing the video that we started in class, why the Industrial Revolution started here, and finish the video guide that I gave you, as well as reading pages 518 to 528 because you will be having a quiz in class on this tomorrow. And tonight's PowerPoint goes right along with the reading, so if you do both of them together, you should be all set for your quiz. So let's get started. So the Industrial Revolution is a very important time period in European history, specifically because it started in Europe and then spread to the rest of the world, and many historians would argue is probably one of the most influential and significant periods in history because of how drastically it changed so many things. It is considered to be debatably, as you can see here, the most important development in human history in the last 10,000 years. And the reason for that is because it altered the European economy, it provided steam power for factory production and transportation developments, and we're going to also talk about textiles, coal, and iron industries because they were the heart of the Industrial Revolution. So there's a lot of information that we're going to be covering, but it's important that you understand it because of how significant it has been on human history. Ultimately, all of the products in your home, everything you own, you wouldn't have if it wasn't for the Industrial Revolution. So we're going to do a brief overview, and then we're also going to kind of go backwards a little bit and talk about the Agricultural Revolution and then why it started in England and so forth. So overall, the machines that were created started to replace not only human power but also animal power in the production and also manufacturing of goods. So before this, before machines were invented and created, everything was pretty much done by hand. One of the most significant inventions would be the steam engine, and this is really the turning point. It took place in the 1780s, specifically in producing textiles. And so as a result of this, Europe is going to transition from an agricultural to a commercial society, and one that also becomes a modern industrial society as well. As late as the 1830s, only a small fraction of British working people were employed in factories. So that is important to keep in mind as well. Even though it's going to have a huge and significant change, only a small were working in factories. And a big reason for that is because unemployment is going to be on the rise because you don't need as many people anymore because the machines are doing all the work. So yes, we will be talking about the positive effects of the Industrial Revolution, but as you can see, some negative effects are going to come about as well. Eventually, industrialism is going to spread all across Europe, probably by about the 1850s, but we're mainly going to start talking about why and how it started in England, and then eventually it's going to spread to other countries. So the economic changes of the Industrial Revolution, they did more than any other movement to revolutionize life in Europe and also Western civilization in general. So that's why it's so important that we talk about this, that we spend an entire unit on it, because many historians agree that this is probably one of the most significant and important turning points in history. Before this, they say the Neolithic times, back when there was stone tools and iron tools, so that was probably the only other most radical change in society, and that's why it's so important that we discuss. So how and when did the Industrial Revolution begin? Let's talk about the roots. It's going to start actually all the way back to the Commercial Revolution. Now notice the time period here. The Commercial Revolution lasts all the way from 1500 to 1800, so we are talking about 300 years of change here. We've discussed the Commercial Revolution already together in class, but let's review. Basically, this was the economic growth in Europe that was brought on by the Age of Exploration because of the new products from the Columbian Exchange that were coming in after the Age of Discovery. This is when the commercial revolution is going to begin. But remember, that was originally because of mercantilism. And so the economic system is going to change. The price revolution is ultimately what stimulated that production. And also, eventually, we get into the rise of capitalism, specifically with the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company. And we'll talk a little bit more about capitalism as this unit progresses. The reason that the price revolution and the commercial revolution took place is because they had a surplus of money. And so instead of just putting it back into the economy or, causing inflation or anything like that, they used it to make investment in ventures in order to make a profit. So that's really where capitalism comes from. And also, this is the emergence of a middle class. They started to provide leadership for the economic revolution. For example, those joint stock companies that I had mentioned before. So instead of everything just being controlled by the government, the middle class now is starting to emerge. Also, we have, in addition to this, the inventions of the scientific revolution. There was all sorts of mechanical inventions, technological advances that allowed for easier means of travel during the Age of Discovery, and also allowed for the advancement in economic ventures as well. And then, of course, last but not least, we have the increase in Europe's population. So since you have more people, you have larger markets, therefore you have a higher demand, and therefore all of these kind of came together. So continuing on with the commercial revolution, the next step in getting to the industrial revolution is known as the cottage industry, or what is known as proto-industrialization. And we talked about this a little bit already in chapter 15 of your book, but we're going to review just so you understand it. So this was basically the industry that took place in the country, or in the rurals, and it was really, really important in the growing economy of the 18th century. So it's almost like the Industrial Revolution couldn't have happened if it wasn't for the cottage industry. Basically, the rural population was having a difficult time in making any money. They were competing with the markets that were taking place in the cities, and so they wanted to supplement their income, and so they created the cottage industry. And so the merchants in the cities also, they wanted cheap rural labor rather than paying members of what were known as guilds. Guilds are kind of like an ancient version of a union. And so these guild members, basically they were very skilled, and they would charge very high fees for their labor and for their work. So people didn't want to spend that kind of money, so they said, well, why don't we just get it cheaper from the people who are creating cloth and so forth in the country. What eventually wound up happening, though, with the rise of industry is that something known as the putting out system. A lot of people were put out into the countryside as a result of this. And Tom Ritchie has a video on it that we've watched before if you want to go back and review what it's all about. And so manufacturing with hand tools in these peasant cottages that took place in the cottage industry came to challenge the urban craft industry. So really it became competition with one another. Could you get cheaper materials from the rural population who wanted to supplement their income, or did you want to spend more money from the craft workers in the guilds in the cities? So the cottage industry basically was merchant capitalists. What they did is they provided raw materials such as wool to these rural families, and then they would finish the products or semi-finish the products in order to send it back to the merchants for their payments, and then the merchants as a result would sell it to the public. So it really became a whole economic system, and then as a result the merchants were able to sell those goods for a high profit. Probably one of the most important things that came out of the cottage industry is going to be wool cloth, because of what they were able to produce on hand looms in order to create fabric and textiles. It was really a family enterprise. So we're going to bring some social history into this for just a moment. So essentially, families would work together, everyone would be involved. They would basically have 4 or 5 spinners in order to keep one weaver steadily employed. And so those 4 or 5 spinners would be operated by members of the family. Basically, the husband and wife would try to find more thread, if possible, from those merchants, and also more spinners, because the more work they were able to put out, the more money they could make, and therefore support their family. And everybody really worked together. So this is before public education and so forth. So children, a lot of times, families would produce lots of children so that they could have lots of workers. And it was really a family economic system. Sometimes, though, they would subcontract work to others if they couldn't handle it all themselves. The problem with the cottage industry and why we don't have it anymore is really because there was a lot of dispute between the cottagers and the merchants over weight, over the quality of the cloth. There weren't any regulations like we have today, so ultimately product could be different from cottage to cottage. Also, the labor was very unorganized. It was difficult for the merchants to control because they weren't necessarily there overseeing the work. So you can really see the problems that come from this. Also, these merchant capitalists, as a result, would search for more efficient methods. And that's eventually what is going to lead to the growth of the Industrial Revolution and factories, especially with new inventions that are going to replace this hand labor or human labor with factories. So what were the results? Basically, as a result, these poor rural families were able to supplement their incomes. They were able to make more money. As a result of the unregulated production that was taking place, experimentation and diversification of goods started to take place, and that's why we have new inventions that came out of the cottage industry to kind of make a better and also a faster product. And that included things like textiles, knives, forks, housewares, buttons, gloves, clocks, musical instruments. So all these everyday products that people maybe would only have one of, or you were lucky if you had a clock or something like that, they were able to make a lot more of them and make them a lot cheaper. So really this expendable income, I guess you could say, and these products that a lot of people wanted. Eventually, the cottage industry, it's important that you understand, it first flourishes in England, and we're going to talk about why. Basically, it's because of the technology. The cottage industry exists before the steam engine. That's why it's called proto-industrialism technology. Most of the things were done by hand, but we will talk about some of the inventions later on in this PowerPoint. Eventually, in 1773, John Kay is going to invent what is known as the flying shuttle. And so basically, if you Google an image, you can see what a flying shuttle looks like. It's very, very small. And it allowed the weaver to be able to throw the shuttle back and forth on the hand loom with one hand. Therefore, something so simple, but it doubled the amount of work that they were able to accomplish. But notice the year, 1733. The Industrial Revolution really doesn't take off until another 20 years. But just one simple invention is going to help increase with the production of goods. Oh, and here's a picture of it. I forgot I had one in the PowerPoint. And so it cut the manpower need on the looms in half. And so as a result, only one person needed to operate a loom instead of two, because it would free their other hand to be able to do other things. Then we have the next invention, a picture here. James Hargreaves invented what is known as the spinning jenny. In fact, he named it after his daughter. And so it took the spinning wheel, which originally was done by hand, and turned it into machine power. The spinning jenny was important because it was hand operated. So again, still not machine power, but it was very simple, and it was also very inexpensive, pretty easy to make. And again, the whole point of it was to try to increase production as much as possible. So the early models had been between about 6 to 24 spindles mounted on a sliding carriage, and each of those spindles spun thread. And so the more spindles you had, the more fabric you were able to produce in a short amount of time. Mostly the cottage industry was made by women. And so it's important too that you understand the size of the spinning jenny. It was something that could very easily fit inside somebody's home. So a factory wasn't necessarily needed yet. And as I mentioned, it was usually worked by women. They would move the carriage back and forth with one hand, and then they would turn the wheel to supply power with the other. And so it was easy, very simple, and allowed for as much fabric to be produced as possible. The spinners now, with the spinning jenny, outpaced the weavers, which typically was done by the husband, and they would use that flying shuttle. So as I said before, it was a family affair. Eventually, things are going to change even more. About 30 years later, in 1769, Richard Arkwright is going to invent what is known as the water frame, and this is going to improve the thread spinning even more. So basically, instead of just 30 spindles, there were several hundred spindles that were on a machine, and it was run on water power instead of hand power. So really taking the spinning jenny and making it completely obsolete, because we are now tripling the amount of work done, and it's not necessarily done by hand anymore, but it's used by water. So the water frame needed to be built next to some type of running water, a river or something like that. And this is when we start going into the factory system, because you're going to need specialized factories in order to run these water frames. And these factories, even though it was still powered by water, you still needed employees. And so as many as 1,000 workers could work on a water frame. Also, the other reason that it was more efficient is because it produced coarse, strong thread. And so then it was put out for respinning and hand-powered spinning jennies. So ultimately, the two inventions wound up working together. So this is just kind of a cool little history lesson in explaining how the cotton industry was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and we can see how gradually these inventions started to change. Finally, we have what is known in 1779 by Samuel Crompton, a spinning mule, and basically it combined the water frame and the spinning jenny together, obviously, most importantly, to try to increase as much output as possible. And so this is, as a result of the spinning mule, all the cotton spinning gradually is going to be done in factories, no longer in people's homes anymore. Okay, so we're going to talk about now why England was the first country to industrialize. Not only the first country in Europe, but really the first country in the world. Your book goes into detail talking about why it wasn't necessarily China, and I would definitely recommend that you spend some time on that, reading it, to help you understand why England was first. Notice the years here, though. It began ultimately in the 1780s. Now, that doesn't mean the agricultural revolution. That's going to begin prior to this. But the Industrial Revolution begins in earnest in the 1780s and is complete probably until about the 1830s, maybe even the 1850s. So to kind of stop and pause for just a moment, let's put this in perspective about what else is happening in Europe at the time. We have in 1791, that was the French Revolution. 1799 is when Napoleon crowned himself emperor. And 1815 was the Congress of Vienna. So basically everything that we just recently discussed at the end of period 2 was also happening simultaneously with the Industrial Revolution. So it's really important that you put those things into perspective. And so one of the main reasons why it did not take place on the rest of Europe or in continental Europe is, think about what England is geographically. It's an island, it's secluded, and they were protected really from the Napoleonic Wars. Now, we know that England was involved, but none of the fighting actually took place in England. And so that's because the Napoleonic Wars had such a devastating effect on continental Europe. That's one of the main reasons why they didn't industrialize as early as England, and a number of other factors that we're going to discuss. So let's talk about the economic and social factors first. First of all, let's talk about the land and the geography of England. As I mentioned before, it's in isolation from the rest of the continent, so it offered a lot of protection and allowed it to be independent and develop on its own. They also had a very good supply of both coal and iron, and this is probably one of the biggest and most important reasons. As we learned in our video today, and as we're also going to, as you finish the video tonight, this is going to be significant in the development of industrialization in England. Specifically, Wales and also northern England, they were the main and most important sources of that coal and iron. And so as a result, they didn't need help from foreign countries because they could get it all themselves. Another thing is the fact that they had easy access to waterways. Not only waterways in terms of the fact that it was an island and therefore they could travel very easily across the ocean, but also because they had different navigable rivers. And those rivers were important not only for transportation and trade and communication, but also as giving them an alternate source of power as well. What's important to know about this from a geographic standpoint is not a single part of England was more than 20 miles away from a navigable river, so very, very important. And also it was really a lot cheaper to ship goods by water than it was by land, especially because they didn't really have paved roads back then and everything was still done by horse and carriage. Eventually, it's going to come out of their expanding role in the Atlantic economy of the 18th century. So going back to the 1700s with the Age of Discovery and even before the Revolutionary War, the fact that England had colonies that they were able to trade with. They grew their navy. Remember, we've talked extensively about the fact that the Royal Navy or the British Navy is the most powerful in the world. And they developed all sorts of ports that provided protection from either foreign invasion and also really helped with their commercial empire. As I mentioned before, too, the agricultural revolution was really important to the development of the Industrial Revolution. You had the supply of cheap and abundant labor, specifically from the enclosure movements. A lot of those farmers that no longer benefited from the land that became enclosed, they moved to towns, they moved to cities, they were looking for jobs, and so that labor was cheap and abundant. Also, the revolutions that took place in agriculture allowed for fewer farmers and therefore fewer farmers to feed larger numbers of people because the machines were replacing and doing that, the seed drill, the crop rotation, and so forth. And so as a result, more food means more people, and as a result, the British population doubled in the 18th century. And so the demand for specific goods is going to increase, and therefore that is why you need the labor, and that is why, as you can see, it's like a big, huge, vicious cycle. So more people were freed up from farms to work in factories or in the distribution of other goods and services. So this abundant supply of labor allowed for the abundance in making new things and stuff. And so people moved around all over England in search of land, either to continue with the agricultural revolution or other forms of employment, which eventually is going to lead to the development of factories and urbanization. And so the rural wage earners, the ones that were kicked out of the enclosure movement, they were relatively mobile, kind of nomadic in a sense, in that they could really work anywhere. And feudalism at this point, we know that Napoleon ultimately ended it in France, and it's pretty much non-existent in most of Europe except for Russia. And so serfdom is abolished, and so people are looking for jobs, they're looking to be paid, they're not just going to look to survive anymore. Also, and your book goes into detail about this, so please make sure you pay attention to it, but large supplies of capital are now going to be available because of over 200 years of profitable commercial activity, especially from the Age of Discovery. And so capital basically is defined as something that allows you to produce more goods. So that capital could be factories, it could be land, it could be people. And so they had this readily available to them because they avoided many of the continental wars. They were not part of the French Revolution. They were not part of the 7 Years' War. I mean, they were, but that took place on American soil, not on British soil. So England was very protected from these wars. Also, the British merchants and the upper class had really prospered during the wars. The merchants, because they were supplying other countries with, remember, they were known as kind of the shopkeepers of the world, so they were the ones who were supplying the rest of the armies with the needed weapons that they had, and also the gentry, many of them fought in the wars and were paid for it. They were paid soldiers. And so the government was able to establish what is known as the Bank of England all the way back in 1694, their own central bank. Now this may not seem like a big deal, but what it allowed for was really the ultimate free flow of money, and that the bank would supply basically loans for companies in order for them to be profitable. And as we know, this is also something that Napoleon later did in France in order to stabilize their economy. So very important that they had a central bank. Also, insurance companies like Lloyd's of London, they provided protection from commercial failure. If any of you or your parents own a business, you know that business insurance is very important in case there's a fire or just to kind of if the economy goes bad. So this is something that took place all the way back in the 17th century. Another important aspect of British success is that of entrepreneurs. Now, an entrepreneur is basically somebody who is highly motivated. They are very inventive, and it includes engineers, capitalists, and they possess a certain skill, and they're willing to take on different risks. In other words, hey, I'm going to invest my money, I'm going to invest my time and my resources into creating this new invention, and hopefully something good will come out of it. And that's exactly what happened in England. And so many young men from the upper classes or the gentry really started to take on careers in business that allowed them to have the resources to become entrepreneurs. The middle class, too, they had the ability to be entrepreneurs as well if they were able to develop their own wealth from business. Many Calvinists in the middle class were driven by that Protestant work ethic. Remember, one of the things we talked about with John Calvin is that you should work really to show your devotion to God. And so I guess you could say they weren't lazy, not at all. Very hardworking people, devoted and moved by their faith, and also in the efforts to make money, which was really important to them, obviously. Another reason England was successful is because it had a colonial empire. It gave them access to raw materials, for example, cotton from the New World before the Revolutionary War. And so these raw materials helped them to develop many new industries. And a lot of that came from the African slave trade as well, using the African slave labor to get those raw materials, grow those raw materials like tobacco and cotton and rice and so forth, and bring it back to Britain that allowed them to make money and use. And another reason Britain was so successful is because of their government. Remember, they were not an absolute monarchy. They were a constitutional monarchy, and the Parliament allowed and promoted commercial and industrial interests because as a result, those interests were then represented in Parliament as well, because Parliament was represented by the people or by the majority. And so instead of just looking at the interests of nobility or the interests of a king, they would allow for the interests of Parliament to be used. And so because they had these well-established financial institutions, the bank that we mentioned before, they were able and ready to make loans available that allowed these businesses to flourish. So people didn't really have to start from scratch. They could get a loan from a bank, and they had maybe a new invention, and businesses took off. And so because the monarchy was limited, government didn't necessarily stifle the growth and expansion of the middle class, but instead it allowed it to grow very well. So as you can see, Britain was very unique in its government, in its economic situation with a central bank, its colonial empire. All of these together is really going to be important in allowing Britain to be successful in industry. They had a very stable government. The fact that it was not affected by those wars that we mentioned before allowed the government to continue to be stable and therefore support industry. Also in Parliament, with the rise of the House of Commons, basically that's kind of like one aspect of their legislative branch that was represented by the common people, and it allowed the government to cooperate with the middle class and really secured middle class loyalty, so there was no reason to overthrow the government, and that's why it was so successful. In contrast, as we know, this is complete opposite of what was happening in France. The fact that it was an absolute monarchy and they did not listen to the middle class or the common people, and that's why they had the French Revolution. So that's one of the reasons why it was successful in England and not in France. And then also it was very favorable toward the growth of industry. Why wouldn't it be? Because ultimately it's helping the economy. So good things. Ooh, looks like we're repeating. Also, parliamentary legislation was favorable toward the growth of industry. For example, the repeal of what is known as the Bubble Act allowed for the creation of joint stock companies. I'm not going to go into detail on that, probably not a detail you need to know. If you want to look it up, Google it. But with these joint stock companies, this is going to be the increase in capitalism. Also, the Lowe's Act allowed for limited liability for business owners. In other words, kind of an insurance policy, basically. And then the Navigation Acts and the Corn Laws that were in existence during the 18th century limited mercantilism. And so it allowed for more freedom with individual middle class and merchants to make business decisions instead of relying on the government. Really important. Eventually, too, because textiles is going to the increase in demand for textiles is really going to start to lead us into the first large factories. So we're going to really get into how the Industrial Revolution started here. There was a constant shortage of thread, and so as a result, they wanted to focus their attention on ways of improving spinning. In other words, to cut their losses. So not really have as much loss in industry, but rather improve on it. And so those inventions that we talked about before, the spinning jenny, the flying shuttle, all of this really helped facilitate increase in production. And then eventually we have what is known as one of the most revolutionary inventions of the Industrial Revolution, which would be the steam engine. And so once they applied the steam engine to textile production, this is probably the key event or the turning point of the Industrial Revolution, because now they could produce much faster and more efficiently. And this was created by Richard Arkwright in the 1780s, and he was the first. He didn't invent the steam engine, but he used the steam engine to power his looms, and so that's when the factories started to increase. It allowed him to not necessarily be on a river anymore, and you could build a factory anywhere. Sorry about that, guys. My phone was ringing. Anyway, in 1784, Edmund Cartwright invented the power loom that we talked about before, and it was powered by horses, water, or steam. Eventually, metallurgical industries flourished as they also started to provide machinery, basically, in other words, metals, and the development of iron and so forth. Now, one of the key cities that was important to the growth and development during the Industrial Revolution was the city of Manchester, which is pictured here. Also, there's a picture of this in your textbook as well. This is a painting, as you can see, a romantic painting. We've looked at it together before. Really juxtaposed, we can see the difference between the factories in the background and then the nature in the foreground. So definitely a contrast of what was happening during the Industrial Revolution. The name of this painting is called The View of Manchester, painted in 1851 by William Wilde. And you can see those hazy smokestacks in Manchester in the background and the sharp contrast to the kind of unspoiled and rural landscape in the foreground. Excuse me. Ooh. And so by the time this painting was finished, it probably had taken over the landscape that you see in the foreground. We're actually going to be doing a DBQ in class together on the city of Manchester and how much it grew, so stay tuned for that. So what were some of the results of this new technology, both good and bad? Well, number one, by 1790, the machines had been able to produce 10 times as much cotton yarn as they had just 20 years earlier. Also, by 1800, the production of cotton thread was England's most important industry. So really, eventually it's going to develop into more than just that with iron and coal and the railroads, but cotton in the early 1800s was the most important. By 1820, it was almost half of Britain's exports. Now you might think like, oh, who cares, it's just cotton, but think about how important that is. All of the clothing that they wore, materials used in furniture, in fabric of any kind, it was important that they had cotton and were able to access it. And so by 1850, just 30 years later, they produced more than half of the world's cotton cloth. So Very, very important. Also think of it too in terms of like uniforms for soldiers, and cotton's used in everything. And so as a result, cotton goods became cheaper and anyone could enjoy it. And so no longer did people just own maybe like one or two articles of clothing, but now they had wardrobes, which didn't exist before this because it was very cheap and easy to get clothing because it was no longer made by hand but made by machine. So poor people could now afford to wear cotton slips. Many of them had several pairs of underwear and so forth. All right, let's move on from cotton to steam engines and coal. The use of coal power steam engines is really considered to be one of the hallmarks of the Industrial Revolution. Many people actually consider it to be probably the most important technological advancement of the time period. And so basically what it did is it transitioned from wood burning to coal burning. And since England had a very large, high supply of coal, this was very easy for England to do. Before that, they would kind of create their own charcoal, where basically what happened is they would process wood. It was mixed with iron ore to produce what is known as something called pig iron. And then much of England, as well as Europe, was experiencing deforestation in order to create this pig iron. And so they needed to come up with a different energy source. And so coal provided, by burning coal, it provided steam power, and those steam power was used in several industries. And so by 1850, England produced 2/3 of the world's coal. And so, and that's because of the vast coal mines that were available in England. And so as a result, they produced the steam engine. Again, as I mentioned before, one of the most important technological advances. The first two men responsible for this all the way back in 1698 and 1705 were Thomas Savior and Thomas Newcomen, and they invented steam pumps. And the reason for this is they needed to try to remove water from the coal mines so that it was easier to get it out. Both of them were very inefficient, and so they needed somebody to come along and make a better version of it. And so at first, they were important because they replaced the pumps that were powered by animals, and therefore it was more easy to transport and they could kind of put it anywhere, but as I mentioned, very inefficient. So along comes James Watt. Definitely make sure you know that name. He invented and patented the first steam engine in 1769, and he worked along with Thomas Newcomen as well, kind of taking his version and making it a little bit better. By the late 1780s, the steam engine was used regularly in production in England. So obviously, as you can see here, it took several years to perfect, but became very revolutionary in the factories and industry in England. And the steam engine was probably one of the most fundamental advances in technology, as I've said before, which gave what we know as the factory system. And the reason for this is because it replaced water power in the cotton mills. And so as a result, it allowed these factories, they didn't necessarily just have to be built on rivers anymore, they could be built anywhere. And this is going to create huge transformations, not only in manufacturing, but also in transportation, like the railroads, which we'll talk about just a little bit. And so the iron industry was transformed by this new steam engine that was invented. And so as a result, it gave rise to heavy industry, or the manufacturing of machinery and materials used in production. And so that's where we give rise to what is known as the factory system. And so they switched from charcoal to what is known as coke, and they smelt in smelting pig iron. So again, details I don't think you necessarily need to know, but as you can see, it's a gradual process that started to change. And so this was created in essence by Henry Cort in the 1780s. He created what is known as a puddling furnace, refining that pig iron with coke, as you can see it a little bit here in this graphic down at the bottom of the slide. He also developed heavy-duty steam-powered rolling mills in order to shape that iron into any shape or form. And so that's why they could use the iron to build different parts for machines, or beams for buildings to make them more sound, or used specifically later on in railroads. So this was also very revolutionary. Instead of being done by hand, it could be done by machine. And so not only did England produce a lot of cotton and coal, but also more than half of the world's iron. And you can see how significant that would be to their economy. All right, last thing we're going to talk about is the revolution in transportation, specifically with the locomotive and the railroad. And this was made possible by the steam engine. And it was necessary that this took place because they needed to be able to distribute the goods that they were making and to deliver the raw materials to the factories. They needed a way to get this stuff to these places much more efficient and much faster and cheaper. So before we get to the railroads, one system that they were able to create, it was a canal system. Very important in the interdependent industries like the railroad industry, steel, and also coal. In order to get these materials between one another, the canals proved very, very valuable. And so after that, they also started to recreate or reinvent or improve the roads, and that also helped improve land travel. Not only that, but we also have the steamboats. For example, the first one, 1807, was created by Robert Fulton. It was called the Clermont. And this is in the United States, but it traveled from New York City all the way up to upstate New York in Albany. And it was, the reason that it was successful is because it used a Watt steam engine in order to power it. And it made two-way river travel possible and also travel on the high seas a lot faster as well. So no longer did they need to rely on sail power, but now they could use steam engines. And so the first steamship to cross the Atlantic Ocean, that took place in 1838. Finally, railroads, also known as the Iron Horse. The first steam engine or the first steam wagon was used in London in 1803, and then later it was adopted in 1812 for its use on rails. George Stephenson in 1825, moving just a little bit further, he created the railroad locomotive to be used successfully in a commercial setting. And by 1829, it was widely used in England. So we can see the progression here in our timeline. It took about 30 years, but became very, very revolutionary in the revolution. In 1830, this is a replication of his first, what is known as a rocket, which is kind of ironic that it was called the rocket because it only traveled at about 16 miles an hour. But that was huge back then because you could put so much product on it, and including people, and it traveled all the way from Liverpool to Manchester. And so this is probably one of the world's first most important railroads because it was right in the heart of industrial England, connecting factories, connecting cities, really important at this time. And so here's kind of an artist's rendition of the first opening of the railroad in 1830. And so this is just the beginning and led to a huge wave of railroad building, kind of open air, as you can see, traveling slowly at 16 miles an hour. People love it. Eventually, a lot of private companies started to invest in the railway system, and they built more rail lines in the 40s. And let's talk about the impact of this, both good and bad. Number one, it reduced the cost of shipping and freight on land, which was very important. It also helped in the growing regional and national market, which increased industrial productivity in meeting that larger demand that the increasing population needed so drastically. It also helped facilitate growth of an urban working class because people found new jobs. They needed people to build these railroads and also operate them and run them. So new jobs were made available. And so as a result, those cottage workers, the farm laborers, and even peasants started to become railroad workers and builders. And so many people then, it was easy for them to travel from the rural areas to the cities in order to find work. So transportation really helped increase in the job market. This is an example, though, of what it was like if you were third class. And so they didn't necessarily have the fancy cars of the first or second class. As you can see here, a grandmother sitting with her grandchildren in a peasant car or the third class carriage in 1862. And then should look familiar to you as well. This is another painting that we've looked at before, a romantic view of it, kind of like their perceived view that ultimately it's kind of overtaking the landscape and becoming more important. And of course, a romantic artist doesn't necessarily like that very much. So, as we can see, by 1850, Britain really ruled the world with its industrial supremacy, producing 2/3 of the world's coal, half of the world's iron, half of the world's cotton. Their GNP was up 350% in just 50 years, 100% in just 20 years, and the population also is going to increase dramatically in about 70 years. And so the per capita income increased almost 100% in 50 years, and the economy increased faster than the population growth. And so as a result, that created a higher demand for labor. So I guess you could say that England was doing pretty darn well during this time period. And here's here is an example of a chart that kind of tells you the levels of industrialization from 1750 all the way to 1900. And you can see the top bar there, the United Kingdom rising above the others very, very quickly. But the others start to catch up later on, and we'll talk about them more tomorrow. The thing I want to show you is a picture of this building, which was known as the Crystal Palace. It was built in 1841 for an international exhibit, the world's first international industrial fair is exactly what it was, and it was intended to signify Britain's industrial, economic, and military power. So that's really ultimately what it represented. And you can see just by looking at it, imagine coming from France or Germany or the Netherlands or even Russia and looking at this beautiful feat of architecture with iron and glass representing the industry that England was able to accomplish. So here's an indoor picture of the Crystal Palace. As you can see, it was about 1/3 of a mile long and about 800,000 square feet inside the structure. So it was huge, kind of like one big giant home show. Not sure if you've ever been to one of those, but it just displayed new products and new inventions, things that were created with these new inventions. You can see the rugs and the carpets hanging in the background, an area for silks. And also different countries could be represented as well and show off what they were able to accomplish. But ultimately, it was a symbol of the industrial triumph that had taken place in England and really a turning point in history. This definitely represented the fact that people could now buy stuff and they could have extra stuff if they wanted. So that's our introductory lesson on the Industrial Revolution. Tomorrow we're going to talk a little bit about how it spread to other countries and also some of the negative effects of industrialization on families and the role of men and women during this time period. So make sure you read your pages, finish your video, and I will see you tomorrow.